From Jerusalem, the wisdom of the Mishnah has resonated for centuries. In houses of study, men of all ages immerse themselves in sacred texts, their faces reflecting deep concentration. Today, that wisdom transcends borders. Men and women in homes and cafes study the Mishnah on their devices. Our Mishnah course in 2026 blends ancient wisdom with modern accessibility. Join this living tradition.
Shalom, shalom. Thank you for being here with us, and happy 2026. This is Abel Flores speaking, and as always, I am deeply grateful that you are here with us on your channel, La Mishnah TV. The year 2026 promises many changes in the world and represents a continuation of ongoing processes, mainly spiritual processes from the unseen realms that were already unfolding in 2025. I am not referring only to conflicts around the world, but also to technological changes and paradigm shifts, which, from a certain point of view, are the most concerning. With awareness and attentiveness to all these developments, especially since the person speaking to you is an active journalist and has lived the news from a professional perspective for more than 2 decades, we have adapted our free Mishnah course for this year to a simpler, more accessible, and shorter format in order to better fit your circumstances and needs. In addition, all our content will continue to be published in both English and Spanish to reach a wider audience. We will also be sharing supporting and supplementary material for each class and each video in our WhatsApp and Telegram groups, as well as on social media. Always, of course, with the support of our digital platform, lamishna.com, where you will find all the classes organized and divided by categories. Now, imagine for a moment that you are holding an ancient key in your hands. A key that does not open just any door, but a door that connects 4 worlds that are usually studied separately: the Torah or Bible, the Talmud, mysticism, namely Kabbalah, and Christianity, the teachings of the first century, from Jesus to his apostles. The Mishnah unites these 4 worlds in an extraordinary and irrefutable way. The Mishnah is a key that reveals contexts, traditions, and meanings that today remain hidden from most people. That key exists, and it is called Mishnah, a Hebrew word that means teaching. Most people read the Torah as a profound, ancient, but incomplete text. They see stories. Some see only legends, commandments, laws, instructions. But they do not know how these were applied, or whether those commandments have anything to do with them today. What did keeping the Sabbath mean in real life? How did sacrifices function? What did purity and impurity look like in daily life? All of this is explained by the Mishnah. It is the practical manual that reveals what the Torah does not fully develop. Without it, without the Mishnah, we read in darkness. With it, everything is illuminated, because the Mishnah is the very Oral Torah that was given at Sinai to the prophets. But here begins something even more surprising. The Mishnah not only explains the Torah, it is also the foundation of the Talmud and of 1,800 years of traditional Rabbinic Judaism. Therefore, whoever masters the Mishnah understands the architecture of halakha, of Jewish or Rabbinic law, the logic of Pharisaic debates, and the spiritual DNA of Orthodox or traditional Judaism. It is like moving from seeing a building from the outside to entering it and understanding its internal structure, column by column. And there is more. Many people study Kabbalah without knowing that its most frequently cited author, Shimon Bar Yochai, was a Tana, that is, a sage from the period of the Mishnah. He is cited multiple times in the Mishnah because it was his era and his historical context. How can one understand the Sephirot, the spiritual worlds, or the tree of life, without knowing the conceptual world in which these interpretations were born. The Mishnah is not only law, it is the intellectual substrate from which mysticism emerges. And there is still one more dimension, one that surprises most people. Unfortunately, very few are aware of this. But personally, I believe this is the most important aspect of all. If you want to understand Yeshua, or Jesus of Nazareth, Paul, and early Christianity, what in academic and intellectual circles is known as proto-Christianity, you must enter the world of the Mishnah. Jesus did not preach in a vacuum. He lived within a first-century Judaism whose principles, debates, and customs are preserved precisely here, in the Mishnah. When the Mishnah explains how the law was interpreted, how people ate, how they prayed, how they judged, how they taught, you are seeing the real world in which Jesus lived and in which Paul was educated at the feet of Gamaliel, one of the rabbis also frequently cited in the Mishnah. If you do not know this, you miss the point. If you do not understand this, you interpret the scriptures within the wrong context. And without context, there is no truth, no possible way to understand the message. Anyone familiar with the basic foundations of communication understands this. Today, in this class, we will open that door so that you can begin to see things that are there, hidden, sometimes encoded, that you do not perceive because your mindset has not been shaped within a Hebrew framework. This is not about converting. This is not about denying your roots. This is about acquiring the basic knowledge necessary to understand the sacred scriptures in their original context. It is about knowing the truth and allowing that truth to free you from doctrines that have little or nothing to do with the authors and protagonists of the biblical texts. We are going to enter together into the anatomy of ancient Judaism, and when you do, you will discover something. The Mishnah is not an old text. It is a map that connects traditions, reveals contexts, and completely transforms your understanding of faith, history, and spirituality. And all of this has a direct impact on your life, regardless of whether you are Jewish, Christian, atheist, or agnostic. This is not about religion, nor even about culture. It is about knowledge that gives meaning to your religion, your culture, and your history. Let us begin, because what is truly revealing, I have not yet told you, and you will want to hear it all the way to the end. Let me begin with a medical analogy, because tradition thinks very highly of bodily metaphors. The Torah, without context, is like medicine without a package insert. The active ingredient is there, it is real, it is powerful, but without knowing the dosage, method of use, and appropriate timing, it can become incomprehensible or even dangerous. And this is where the Mishnah comes in, not as a later addition, but as the medicine of context. The rabbinic tradition teaches that along with the Written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, known in the West as the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, from Genesis to Deuteronomy, an Oral Torah was also transmitted. These were not isolated opinions, but rather interpretive criteria, practical norms, and living customs. Around the year 200 CE, under the direction of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, this tradition was codified in writing, not to freeze it in time, but to save it from oblivion after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and the dangerous annihilation and Holocaust that the Roman Empire was orchestrating against the Jews. Mainly after the failed Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE. Now, you must understand that without this oral foundation, many precepts remain suspended in midair. The Torah says, "You shall take the fruit of a beautiful tree," but it doesn't define which one. The Mishnah answers, the etrog. The Torah commands that words be written on the doorposts of the house, but it doesn't explain how. The Mishnah then details what the mezuzah is, its form, its location, and its purpose. Furthermore, The Mishnah introduces us to the real world of ancient Judaism: trades, coins, measurements, agricultural life, family dynamics, debates of the Sanhedrin, and the functioning of the temple. Not abstract ideas, but everyday existence. It shows us how a flesh and blood Jew thought, debated, and practiced. Therefore, studying the Mishnah is not an archaeological exercise. It is learning to read the Torah through its original lens. It is receiving the complete medicine, with context, with wisdom, and with life. And then the Torah ceases to be an ancient text and becomes once again a human experience, demanding and profoundly relevant because of the ethical and moral values it conveys. Now, let's pause for a moment. Where does this concept of the Torah, or oral law, appear in the Bible, in the written Torah itself? This is a very valid and even necessary question to address in this class. There is a verse that many read quickly, but which rabbinic thought has never interpreted superficially. In Exodus 24:12, God says to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and stay there, and I will give you the tablets of stone, and the Torah, and the commandment that I have written to instruct them." The phrase seems simple, but it is explosive. The Torah is understood as the written text. The commandment, the sages say, is not a poetic repetition, but another category: explanations, applications, unwritten details. And the conclusion is decisive: to instruct them. Instructing is not simply handing over a book. It is teaching with the mouth, with gestures, with example. Deuteronomy 17 goes even further. There the Torah commands that one go to the priests, to the judges of each generation, and obey the teaching that they teach you. It doesn't say the text that you read, but the living teaching that they transmit. The word Torah here is oral, legal, embodied in human authorities. Revelation is not frozen on parchment. In Exodus 18:20, God says to Moses, "And you shall teach them the statutes and the laws, and show them the way in which they must walk, and the work that they must do." To show, in Hebrew, vehodata lahem, implies practical demonstration. No one learns to observe Shabbat by reading definitions. One learns by seeing it lived. That is oral tradition. And Deuteronomy 32:7 says it this way: "Remember the days of old. Ask your father, and he will tell you. Your elders, and they will explain to you." That is why the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot opens by declaring that Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it. It doesn't say he wrote it and left, but that he transmitted it. The conclusion is clear and honest. The written Torah alone is not sufficient. It doesn't define how Shabbat is observed, what tefillin are, or how a trial is conducted. The Oral Torah is not a later invention. It is a necessity that arises from the biblical text itself, from the time of Moses, as I have already demonstrated with verses from the written Torah. To say that both were given at Sinai is not an ideological slogan. It is a careful, responsible, and profoundly Jewish reading of the Torah itself. So if you want to understand the Torah or the Bible, it's clear that you have to study the Mishnah. In short, the Mishnah is the structural foundation of the Talmud. The Talmud, both the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds, is essentially a gigantic discussion about the Mishnah. As you'll hear, the entire Talmud is an eternal discussion about the Mishnah. So if you know the Mishnayot, plural of Mishnah, you will understand what they are discussing. Each Talmudic section begins with a Mishnah, and from it the debate of the Amoraim rabbis unfolds. If you don't know the Mishnah, the Talmud seems like a labyrinth. The discussions lack a starting point, and the technical terms are inaccessible. This basically happens because you would be unaware of the context of the Talmud, which is basically how to apply the Mishnah to the new reality of the Jewish people in the diaspora without a temple. Knowing the Mishnah is understanding the conceptual matrix of the entire Talmud. For this reason, The Mishnah defines the normative theology of Rabbinic Judaism. The categories that dominate Orthodox Judaism to this day come from the Mishnah. Kavanah, intention in prayer; Tumah, tahara, impurity and purity; Reshut harabim, Reshut ayahid, public and private domain; Hefker, abandoned property; Kedusha, functional holiness; Mitzvah, commandment with form and content. Halakha, as a system, was born from the Mishnaic structure. Nothing in Rabbinic Judaism, from the liturgy to medieval legal codification, can be understood without this foundation. The Mishnah explains the leap between the religion of the temple and the religion of the synagogue. After the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, the rabbinic leadership transformed the religious system. The Mishnah documents this critical transition, from sacrifice to study, from the altar to the home, from the priest to the sage, from the temple to the synagogue. Any historical understanding of Orthodox Judaism requires understanding this transformation, and the Mishnah is its primary record. During this short break in the middle of the class, we want to let you know that if you would like to make a donation, you can do so by scanning the QR code you see on the screen, or by clicking the link below in the description. I personally thank you very much for your contribution. Now, let's talk about Kabbalah, because these days many people are interested in studying Kabbalah and all the Kabbalistic literature. And believe it or not, because you're not usually told this, the Mishnah is also the key to understanding Kabbalah. Let's talk, for example, about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a central figure in Kabbalah, considered the father of Kabbalah. The Kabbalistic tradition attributes the authorship of the Zohar to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rashbi, a Tana, that is, a sage from the Mishnah period. In fact, he was one of the most important and eminent disciples of the great Rabbi Akiva. This means that the conceptual language of the Zohar is nourished by the Mishnaic world of the 2nd century. Kabbalistic symbolism is based on the halakhic and spiritual categories of the Mishnah. Shimon Bar Yochai's worldview can only be fully understood if one understands the intellectual universe in which he lived, which was the era of the Tanaim. Furthermore, Kabbalah uses structures and concepts that originate in the Mishnah. Apparently mystical elements derived from Mishnaic legal or ritual categories, spiritual worlds that reflect levels of purity and holiness, Sephirot that reinterpret divine qualities already modeled in ancient rabbinic texts, or the Tree of Life, which articulates processes that in the Mishnah appear as dynamics of holiness, intention, act, and consequence. Classical Kabbalah is not an isolated system, but a mystical development of rabbinic thought rooted in the Mishnah. In fact, Mishnah in Hebrew means teaching, and Kabbalah means reception. But reception of what? Well, of that teaching. Kabbalah is the reception of the Mishnah in its mystical interpretation or perspective. Therefore, you should know that without the Mishnah, Kabbalah becomes incomprehensible or empty esotericism. Many modern readers try to study Kabbalah without a Mishnaic foundation, which leads to fragmented, anachronistic, or completely disconnected interpretations of its origin. Studying the Mishnah allows you to distinguish authentic symbolism from later speculation, genuine Jewish mysticism from modernist reinterpretations, and the original conceptual structure from subsequent adaptations. Of course, you can study Kabbalah without knowing the Mishnah, absolutely, but it will be more difficult. And with that, we move on to one of my favorite topics, which is the knowledge of the Gospels in Christianity, because the Mishnah provides the context of the world of Jesus and his apostles. Stay tuned, because we're about to delve into some profound topics. Now, if you are a Christian of any denomination, Catholic, Evangelical, Protestant, etc., you should know that the Mishnah is a tool for understanding the teachings of Jesus, Paul, and the apostles. Whether you are an academic, enjoy history, or simply want to better understand the New Testament, in all these cases, the Mishnah is necessary for you to deeply understand early Christianity. Jesus and his disciples lived within Second Temple Judaism. This is a historical fact. The first century was a time of intense rabbinic, legal, and halakhic activity. The early Tanaim, such as Hillel, Shammai, Yohanan ben Zakkai, shaped the religious environment in which the ministry and life of Jesus of Nazareth developed. Although the Mishnah was formally compiled in the 2nd century, its content comes from traditions current in the 1st century, transmitted by Hillel and Shammai, a generation before Jesus. Rabban Gamaliel I, a rabbi contemporary with Jesus and founder of the Rabbinic school where Saul of Tarsus, popularly known as the Apostle Paul, was educated. Also, Rabban Gamaliel II and Rabbi Akiva, who were several generations later. But the entire historical framework of the Mishnah is parallel to the life of Yeshua and his disciples. For example, Jesus' discussions reflect debates recorded in the Mishnah, and this gives power to the historical context. Many gospel passages correspond to halakhic tensions that the Mishnah documents in detail, even with more detail than the Gospels themselves. And this is invaluable for anyone who wants to understand the teachings, Mishnayot, of Yeshua in depth, because it provides more information on the subject. Discussions about the Shabbat, ritual purity, oaths, divorce and marriage, tithes, relationship with the Pharisees. Understanding the Mishnah allows one to see Jesus within authentic Jewish debates, not as an isolated figure. For example, Jesus often says, "You have heard, but I say to you." Notice that he is speaking of oral law, of Mishnah. In these cases, he is not quoting the Written Torah, although he eventually does that too, and that is fine and normal. But here, you have to start being sensitive to the terms that Yeshua himself is using. What you have heard, traditions that had been taught, and he either legitimizes or disqualifies them. Just as happens in the Mishnah with the Tannaite rabbis who debate. Any student of the Mishnah knows that Rabbi Yehuda, in many cases, differs from the majority of the sages. And every student of the Mishnah knows that Rabban Gamliel often differs and separates the commandments of the Written Torah from the rabbinic commandments or decrees. If you don't know the Mishnah, you won't get the full benefit of the Sermon on the Mount, nor will you understand the criticisms that Jesus makes of the Pharisees. Because when you know the Mishnah, you will realize which group of Pharisees Jesus is addressing, the school of Shammai or that of Hillel. Another example is Paul, who affirms being a Pharisee, the son of Pharisees, Acts 23 verse 6. This indicates that his intellectual formation is framed within Pharisaic Judaism, the same one that produced the Mishnah. Pauline expressions such as spiritual law, judge with justice, works of the law, customs of the fathers, discern the holy and the profane, have direct resonances in Mishnaic categories. The modern reader without the Mishnah interprets these concepts outside of their original context, which leads to theological misinterpretations, because sometimes many modern interpreters believe that Paul was a philosopher, or a Catholic priest, or a pastor. Nothing of the sort. Paul was not a modern or Orthodox rabbi either. No. Paul was a Tanaic rabbi of the Mishnah, and anyone who takes him out of that context is making a mistake, lying to you, deceiving you, and trying to teach you strange doctrines alien to the life of the historical figure. The Gospels and the Epistles are clarified by understanding the Mishnah, which is basically the DNA of Second Temple Judaism. Aspects such as the tensions between Pharisees and Sadducees, the authority of the sages, the purity rituals, the court system, marriage and divorce, the interpretation of the Torah in daily life, can only be fully understood through Mishnaic literature. Now, let me conclude with an idea that, although it seems simple, is profoundly disruptive. Studying the Mishnah is not an academic luxury or a historical curiosity. Not necessarily. It is a methodological requirement. Without it, we walk blindly through texts that we think we know, but which we only touch upon the surface because it is impossible to understand a text without its context. It is communication science applied to ancient texts, and that science is in fact called philology. The Torah, for example, was not given as an abstract book to be admired from afar. It was given to be lived, and that practical, everyday, concrete meaning is only fully revealed when it's read through the lens of the Mishnah. Without the Mishnah, the Torah becomes excessively spiritualized or dangerously literalized. With the Mishnah, it comes back to life. The same is true of the Talmud and of all of Orthodox Rabbinic Judaism that has defined, without exaggeration, some 1,800 years of history. The Talmud does not float in a vacuum. It thinks, discusses, and breathes the Mishnah. Whoever skips this foundation misses the entire building. And now, a surprise for many. Classical Kabbalah, with all its symbolic language and metaphysical depth, does not arise in a mystical void. It arises from categories, tensions, and structures that were already alive in the thought of the Tannaim. The Mishnah is its hidden grammar. The Sephirot, the Tree of Life, all these Kabbalistic concepts emerge from the Mishnah. The problem is that you didn't know this because you didn't know the Mishnah. The problem is ignorance, because the books and the knowledge are there, sometimes hidden away, but you have to study. Even the teachings of Jesus, Paul, and the apostles are embedded in that same universe. Not understanding the Mishnah is not understanding first-century Judaism. And without that Judaism, early Christianity becomes incomprehensible, or even worse, anachronistic. Jesus and his disciples are unfortunately often judged as anti-Jewish or anti-Pharisee, when the opposite is true. They were Jews, and many of them were Pharisees, as is evident from the way they speak, think, and argue. In short, the Mishnah is the cornerstone of ancient Jewish spirituality, law, thought, and history. Studying it opens a direct door to four worlds that today often appear fragmented: the Torah, Halakha, Kabbalah, and Christianity. Those who connect these worlds not only learn more, but they also understand better. And those who understand better live more deeply, are not easily deceived, and quickly recognize when an ignorant person preaches, teaches, and even worse, tries to exert spiritual authority over them. Knowledge will set you free. Never forget that. Knowledge is power, and we are talking about spiritual power. Thank you very much for staying until the end of the class, and thank you for sharing your time with us. Remember that I will be answering all your questions that you leave in the comments section of this video. Subscribe to our channel, Mishna TV, give us a like, and share this content so that we can continue to grow this beautiful community. Visit us also on our website, lamishna.com, where you will find much reading material and all the classes of our Mishnah course in order. Now I recommend you watch this next video. Shalom.